All right, you come in the back. All right.
A very warm welcome indeed to St. Peter Mancroft Church. On a Wednesday at 1 o'clock every week we have a reflection which is for all who are here in the church. Lovely to see you here today, but also for any who are watching live on our YouTube channel. I'm Edward Carter, the vicar here, and I'm giving the reflection today. I don't know if you remember Victor Borge, that musician, humorist from quite some time ago now really. He had a lovely sketch, very funny sketch, which was called Inflationary Language, which came into my mind the other day. His idea of inflationary language was that you add a number, one number, to every time you use a number in your conversation. So, for example, instead of saying wonderfully, you'd say twotifully, if that makes sense. Or create would become crenine, or before, befive, of course. Tulips, 3 lips, maybe. And you get the picture. So on and so forth, that kind of thing. And my favourite in his sketch was kind of little peak moment. Instead of anyone for tennis, it was any 2, 5, 11-ish, which I thought was quite clever. Anyway, Victor Borge made a bit of a thing out of this sketch, and he did it at various times. And of course, everyone really enjoyed it. Because it was, you could see exactly what he was doing, and it poked fun at something that was very real at the time, back in the 70s, which was inflation. Money was sort of running out of control, really, in terms of inflation. And in a funny kind of way, after many years of virtually no inflation, we're in that situation again suddenly now, this year, 2022. And we know that despite the very funny sketch, inflation actually isn't a joke at all. It really affects people. People who have fixed incomes, of course, certainly affects them very deeply. It affects people with savings, because savings diminish in value if there's lots of inflation. It affects people unevenly. It's very unfair. That's the thing about inflation. And it's rising, as I said, at the moment, partly because of the cost of fuel, also issues to do with supply lines and supply shortages, connected perhaps to the COVID pandemic as well. And it's worth just thinking for a second about the very nature of money. It's something that we all use all the time, of course, in a modern economy, and people really have used for a long, long time. And if you were to pull a banknote out of your pocket now, I know we use cards a lot more, but let's say we had still had a £10 note, it would say on it still, "I promise to pay the bearer on demand." And that's a little clue that money is like a promise. Because the actual little, used to be a paper note, and now it's a sort of funny plasticky note, in itself is practically useless, worthless really. I believe you can use modern banknotes to stir your coffee, by the way, so they might have one little use, but in themselves, they're not really very useful at all. But they carry within them a promise. If you were to go out onto Norwich Market, just near the church here, with a £10 note, a £20 note, then lots of the traders would be more than happy to give you all sorts of lovely things, food, other things as well, in exchange for this seemingly useless little scrap of paper. Because money's a promise. It's a promise that the next person who it's given to will also give something in return. And of course, promises are a fascinating thing. They allow us, when it's in the form of money, to save them up, to kind of store up promises waiting to be redeemed. £1,000 in the bank, in a way, is just an entry on a computer, but it's also the promise of being able to redeem all of that for, who knows, a holiday, some food, or whatever we might need. And the other way around, instead of savings, a loan is kind of receiving a promise in advance, an early promise, with a pledge to return that promise later on. That's really what a loan is like. So it connects the present with the future and with the past as well. Promises are indeed fascinating things. And of course, a promise is extraordinarily easy to create. To build or make a chair or a piece of furniture or a big building takes a lot of effort and sweat and graft. To create a promise takes practically no effort. I could promise you today that I will do your washing up for a whole year. I didn't make that promise, but if I did, just with 3 or 4 words, I've changed the whole of the next year for me and for you. Isn't it fascinating how just a few words in that form, a promise really properly made and kept to, just changes all sorts of things. And the thing about inflation is that it undermines that promise, the promise in money. If inflation was 100% in a year, then instead of your £10 note being worth such and such over on the market, it's only worth half that. It's a bit like saying, I'll make a promise, but you know what, in a year's time, it'll only be half what I promised. And that's the problem with inflation. It undermines the promises that are made. 100% inflation feels dreadful. There's a thing called hyperinflation. When that runs out of control, then basically money becomes completely worthless. Most famously in Germany, between the two world wars, there was hyperinflation. And what that meant was that the people who'd saved up money over many years, worked hard perhaps for it, found that all of those stored up promises were suddenly completely lost, gone. What did that mean? Well, it meant lots of mistrust of the world, of others, a kind of retreat into oneself, no longer wanting to offer promises and receive promises back. All of that human interaction was undermined. And of course, in Germany between the wars, it led to a very dangerous political outcome, instability, and then conflict, and strong leaders who promised to restore security, but actually offering something quite else instead. Well, a promise also is a very spiritual idea, not just in terms of how we relate to one another, the way in which we make promises to each other, but also the scriptures, the Bible, which I, as a Christian minister, read day by day. The Bible is full of promises that God makes. And they're called often covenants, the covenants that God made with Noah, with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Joshua, King David, great covenant God made with him. And then for Christians, the new covenant, a new promise made between God and his creation in the person of Jesus Christ. So yes, money is like a promise. Yes, the promises we make day by day to each other are very important. But for me, as a Christian, I always try and place all of that within a bigger picture, which is the secure and safe promises that God makes with us, with his people, with his creation, with the world, which he loves and brings into being day by day. And what's the difference between God's promises and our worldly promises, or the promise in money? Well, the difference perhaps is that those promises from God really are secure. They're never eroded away. They never lose their value. They never become worth only 50% of what they were, or hyperinflation means they're actually useless. No. With God, there isn't any inflation of that kind, reducing the value of his promises. They are secure. We can trust in them day by day, month by month, in fact, for all time. That's what the Bible actually describes, the confidence that we can have in God's promises. So although it's fun to enjoy a bit of Victor Borge, any 2 5 11ists instead of any 1 for tennis, yes, that's fun. Although inflation can seem like a bit of a joke, and we say, goodness me, you used to be able to buy 7 pints and a Mars bar for £5, which I can just remember when I was a student, although I'm sure I never actually bought 7 pints and a Mars bar for £5. Nowadays, you wouldn't get 1 pint for £5, although we can laugh about all of that, and it's fine to laugh. I think, nonetheless, my prayer is that, well, today and now, those most in need of help and protection from inflation will receive some of that help and support, that we as a community, as a city here perhaps, can offer that support. But also that all of us, me, yes, maybe you as well, will appreciate again God's promises to us, which really are secure. We can be confident in them. We don't need to worry that they will be withered away, inflated away, we might say, and lost, and somehow something that we can no longer access. So that's my prayer for me, and hopefully for you as well, that we can trust in God and his promises, and that those caught up in the world with the way in which promises are no longer kept for them would receive that support and help and care, perhaps even from us, as they need it in the coming weeks and months. Thank you very much for listening to my short reflection today. They happen every Wednesday at 1 o'clock here in the church, and they're live streamed on YouTube. Do please join us again next week and in any future weeks that you can. Thank you again for listening to me today. Thank you.